I'd like to address an issue that has been dramatized in the past couple decades by an assault on something that I took for granted when I was a child. I did not think it was a theory. For me, it was a principle. It was a principle. A theory is something which is supported only by a small amount of evidence. The earth being spherical is not a theory. A theory. It may or it may not be. It's basically a fact. And it's there it is. The evidence for evolution was so overwhelming that, in fact, people simply assumed it was a principle of biological science. It was overwhelming. It wasn't just there's a little bit here and there's a little bit there. Overwhelming. And I was in the 10th grade in 1943. And in 1943, my biology teacher talked about evolution as something that was simply confirmed by all the evidence. It was inconceivable in 1943 that somebody would enter the Detroit public school system. Do you understand this? That somebody would enter the Detroit public school system to tell me that evolution was only a theory, only a probable way, a possible way of looking at the facts. They would have been expelled, humiliated. However, I didn't imagine the future that is now taking place, that is now the present in the United States of America. There is now an assault, and it's very strong, on what we call the foundations of biological science, and the foundations of biological science are the foundations also of modern pharmacology and medicine. Do you understand? The only reason we're all in this room right now, the only reason why most of us are in this room alive at the age we are, all right, is because of the development of the biological sciences, and one of the fundamental principles of the biological sciences is evolution. You can't even talk about genetics without talking about evolution. And in fact, most of the people complaining about evolution wouldn't be around to complain about it. Do you understand? They wouldn't be around to complain about it without the biological sciences and the principle of evolution on which it rests. So we now have, it shows up. A few years ago, they were doing this in Kansas, every so often in Kansas. I used to like Kansas because of Bus Stop. I like Bus Stop. But, then, back in 1999, a local school board, or the state school board in Kansas, decided to offer an alternative to evolution in the public schools. Ultimately, the school board, there was such pressure put upon it, withdrew it because the school board phrased it in such a way, hoping to get around the ban that had already been established by the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court, as you know, changes its mind. If you change the personnel on the court, the decisions of the court can change if there's sufficient pressure. Well, here is this assault again, overwhelming. And I have to talk about the nature of the assault because it's changed. Now, I have to talk first of all about science. Science is often confused by people with technology. There are all kinds of people who know how to work the new technology. But they don't understand science because science isn't technology. The new technology flows from science, but it is not science. Some people think that science is a set of conclusions. Well, there are all kinds of conclusions that have come out of science, but the conclusions aren't science because the conclusions keep changing, right? And the third, which is correct, is that science is a method. It's a method for the discovery of truth, which is revolutionary. It's a method for the discovery of truth which has another name, which comes from Greek. It's called empiricism. Truth is a function of experience, or to put it another way, truth is a function of evidence. And in fact, that was articulated by an English philosopher who's often regarded as the father of modern empiricism. He's often accused of writing Shakespeare. His name is Francis Bacon. And Bacon, in the early part of the 17th century, articulated this principle, that ultimately the way to truth is not to read old books. The way to truth is to study what you are making conclusions about. Go out and look. And out of that would ultimately come the thing we got in junior high school, the method. First you make an observation, right? You go look. And then on the basis of your observation, you make or create a hypothesis, a statement. The earth is round. I don't know. Okay. Then, that's not enough. That's just a hypothesis. Then you have to develop what we call the program of verification. What evidence do you require to prove the truth of the statement? So then you get in a boat, do you understand? Like Magellan, you start out somewhere in Spain, and you what? You sail around the world, and you discover you haven't fallen off the end of it, and ultimately you will arrive back at the port from which you started. Oh. So there's the program of verification, and then there's the conclusion. After all, truth is not a function of the world, it's a function of statements. So, if you find all the evidence you're looking for, then your hypothesis, your statement is true. If you find absolutely no evidence, you have now fallen off the end, and as you're going down, you say, false. No. If you find absolutely no evidence to support the statement you're making, then you generally say, false. And if you find insufficient evidence, you haven't completed your trip. After all, Magellan died in the Philippines. If you haven't completed your trip, but you haven't fallen off the edge, do you understand? You have insufficient evidence, then you use three words which are the most respectable words in science. I don't know. The fancy Greek word for I don't know is agnostic. Agnostic isn't only about God. An agnostic is a person concerning anything says, I don't know. Got the scientific method? All right, now the scientific method has alternatives, the two alternatives. One is used by people all the time. I was in a class talking to some kids about the origins of humanity, and this kid says, well, I know where people came from. They came from Mars. So I said, what evidence do you have to support the statement you're making? He said, I hear this all the time. I just know. So now you think, well, thank you, Herbert, for sharing. Thank you for sharing that idiocy. Share, thank you. You know. Thank you for sharing. Oh, that's the whole. What are you talking about? I just know. I get this all the time from people. I just know. It's called intuition. And who are you? You're anti-democratic? You don't respect my intuitions? What's wrong with you, huh? Well, I don't want my doctor or my pharmacologist to operate only on, do you understand, intuition. I had a lot of relatives with intuition. Anyway, okay. But the more famous one, alternative to science, was provided by traditional religion. And it's one that's very understandable. We use the word faith, but let me try to explain faith. Faith means trust. Whom are you trusting? Well, the origin of religion is the worship of ancestors. That's where it begins. That's where you get gods from. So you worship ancestors. And it's generally presumed in a society where there is little change that wisdom comes from the past. Right? Sometimes it's even recorded in books. And you generally assume, as it assumed in the Bible, that the smartest people lived a long time ago. That as humanity moves on, it gets dumber and dumber and dumber. I mean, in Judaism, you could never challenge an old rabbi because he came from a generation which was obviously what? Wiser. That's it. Once you got back to Moses, you might as well forget. You can't challenge him because what? He came from the past. So the mood of religion is the worship of ancestors. It is the worship of the past. All you have to do to prove that something is true is you say, Moses said, Moses, he said it? Oh, he said it. Oh, did he say it? Jesus said, oh, did he say that? Oh. So all you do is, it's name dropping. And you always try to prove that your statement isn't new. New statements are never good in religion. Almost all religions, the founders of almost all religions claim that they're simply reviving some truth that's been around for a long time, like Muhammad, from the past. Because if you say it's new, see, science doesn't mind new. But religion always has. So the mood of religion is you always trust the wisdom of the past. And that's called faith. Who am I? Because I used to get that from my relatives. Who do you think you are? Who? Who? Who are you to challenge the wisdom of your ancestors? Who? Oh, well, I don't know. Who? You got the mood? All right. So if your ancestors have handed it down in books, and if they're ancestral books, they are now what? Holy books containing ancestral wisdom. If it says it, it must be true. Well, that's faith. And faith, by the way, is reinforced. It isn't simply an intellectual exercise. Attached to faith are parents, grandparents, do you understand? All the people whom you loved or intimidated, whatever it be. That's what it's attached. That's its power. What you're saying, you're looking at your ancestors, the people who nurtured you, who raised you, whatever else it is, and you're saying, you're wrong. Do you see the power? I mean, that's the power in it. So science is rude. It's insulting. It doesn't care what ancestor said what. It doesn't care what sacred book you found the information. If you don't have the evidence, do you understand, to support the statement you're making, then what? It can be a young person, and he can be challenging his grandfather. If he's got the evidence, he wins. So science is revolutionary. It's the method. It's absolutely revolutionary. And in some ways, it violates one of the strongest bonds of our society, which is the worship and reverence of ancestors. Now, the confrontation between traditional religion and science was inevitable. Science, as an organized system, emerged at the end of the 17th century, and in the 18th century it was flowering, and so there was bound to be this confrontation, because obviously the discoveries of science may at sometimes agree with the ancestors, but it often disagreed with the ancestors. Now, as science emerged, it was reinforced by what I call the social conditions of the time in Western Europe. Otherwise, it would never have gotten off the ground. The first, and very important, was a new money economy that benefited from the new technology which arose from science. All right? And therefore, there were all kinds of people in the middle class and elsewhere who, well, it's good for business. And in fact, as the economic wheels are turning, it's very clear that money without science is going nowhere. And science without money is going. They went together, and out of it came what we call the new system. You want to call it capitalism, whatever it be. That was the system. They went together. So now there were very powerful economic forces defending the emergence of science. The second was the widespread literacy in Western Europe. People now were able to read. Once you learn how to read the Bible, you can read anything. And now with widespread literacy, it was possible to transmit new discoveries, new information to thousands and thousands and thousands of people. One of the reasons was religious exhaustion. For 2 centuries, Catholics and Protestants killed each other. Do you understand? By the middle of the 17th century, they were absolutely exhausted. And what followed those 200 militant years was a force that arose in Western Europe against the clergy. We call it anti-clericalism, and it became very, very strong. It was the idea that the church, that the clergy were preventing progress. All right? They were in the way. And in fact, there were many, many governments now in Western Europe, in France, in Spain, in England, in Germany, whatever, that agreed with that. It's in the 18th century that the Jesuit order was dissolved by the church. All of this coming from the higher ups. So now things are what? Things are, a kind of new freedom is emerging. I mean, the French Revolution didn't suddenly occur all by itself. There was a setting for it. And so with this new freedom, people are now part of an explosion. The explosion, of course, was the rise of academies. All the kings are creating this academy for this, and that academy for this, and this academy for this exploration, and that academy for that. And out of the academy came academics, and the academics are now peopling universities. And now the exploration of nature begins seriously. And the history of nature. In particular, in the 18th century, you can feel it. So let me talk about some of the issues that emerged. The people now studying aren't the clergy. They're somewhat in disrepute. The people that are now studying, they're interesting. They haven't yet worked out PhDs. They're on the way. They're often aristocrats or people of money who've gone to Oxford or Cambridge, who have a great deal of leisure and are really very sharp and have great analytic minds. And they begin to explore on their own. They don't receive a salary. And in fact, in the 18th century, that was characteristic of most of these people. They were just people who arose out of what we call the educated middle or upper classes. And they began to explore and to write. And now one of the big questions was, The history of nature. People are now looking at nature. People are more interested in the world now because all of a sudden they've lost a lot of interest in the afterlife, and now they're beginning to focus on this life. So one of the big questions, there are all these living things around here. Dogs, shrimp, people, whatever. What is their relationship? Out of that, a very famous Swede, without him, oh, how would we ever function in science, in biological science, called Carl Linnaeus, in the 18th century, figured out a system for classifying everything. He said, well, this looks like this, looks like this, looks like this. In fact, they're identical. They're all part of the same species. Well, this species looks like what? That species, they're all part of the same genus. Do you understand? And then we have the family, and then we have the class, the order and the class, the whole thing. Oh. So now everything in the living world is subject to classification, and now you can see connections. All right. Oh. Well, that's very important. It brought order out of chaos and disorder. The second question was hierarchies. We get this all the time with higher and lower. Quite frankly, dear, my values are higher and your values are lower. You get that? Now, how do you figure out what's a higher value and what's a lower one? Is there like get a little, a measurement tape? How do you figure out a higher value or a lower? I mean, what are we talking about? But that was very important. So now people said, well, yes, there are dogs and there are shrimp. Are dogs higher than shrimp? So what they did now with all this classification was they created the tree of life. It had nothing to do with time and change. It had to do with whether you are superior or inferior. I do want to tell you that we ended up on top. No. Is that a mystery to you? We ended up, everything, we are the highest form of life on earth. And then everything is in descending, got a descending order. So that was the issue. And that became very popular in the 18th century. The third was the question of change. Was everybody accepted the fact that everything was created. Because if you didn't, you could get arrested. Anyway, there we go. So everything is sort of created. But was it created and then remained the same? Right? It could have been created 8 billion years ago and still what? Remain the same. Or was it created and continued to change? Oh. Well, there were lots of people who said, no, the Bible is clear. It was made and there was what? No change. But then there were other people who noticed things. For instance, by the 18th century, people had noticed these things you can find everywhere. They're called fossils. They're little pieces of life that have been preserved, you understand, through time. And they found them. And they indicated that there were living things in the past that weren't around anymore. Oh. So there must have been what? Change. Oh. So now, in the 18th century, the whole thing is now, what's natural history? What is the history of natural change? And there were two theories, or three theories that emerged. The first is called uniformitarianism. Did I make it up? It said that change occurred gradually. one of the people who confirmed uniformitarianism lived in the 19th century, the early 19th century. He's the father of modern geology. His name is Lyell. Darwin used him a lot. Was a friend, a student of his, Lyell. The other is catastrophism, which is the change. What happens is things go along smoothly, and then there's a what? A catastrophe. And then it goes along, and every catastrophe, living things die and new things emerge. Oh, there was a man in France called Cuvier who was the champion of that. And in fact, that sort of fits into a Bible story, because on the front page of the New York Times this morning, they take tours through the Grand Canyon where they explain what happened to the Grand Canyon as a result of Noah's flood. Got it? A catastrophe. Okay. So the third theory, which appeared, and this was a sort of a dilettante actually, a French nobleman called the Comte de Buffon, B-U-F-F-O-N. He came up with the notion that life is continuously changing, moving from less complex to more complex forms. That avoids the word higher and lower, right? It eliminates the evaluative part, which doesn't belong in science anyway. So from less complex to more complex, and basically that's evolution. Darwin did not discover evolution. The theory, or the theories about evolution, were going on all through the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century. They were all there. The idea that the story of life is one of continuous change, where less complex moved to more complex, was already in the air. In fact, at the beginning of the 19th century, a Frenchman, appeared who championed evolution. His name was Lamarck. Now, Lamarck did use lower and higher. So for him, evolution was the movement from what? Lower forms of life to higher forms of life. And what he did, which Buffon didn't do, was give a principle. The principle was to explain how it happened. And his explanation has now been rejected by modern science, but it was very current. It basically says, if you are an animal and you're walking on rough terrain and your feet develop big calluses, your offspring may inherit them. So it is the behavior of organisms struggling to survive that are ultimately passed on to their offspring. Now, if that were the case, all the babies would be born with, with calluses if their farmer parents had it. Lamarck's theory, however, was championed by many, many people. Even Arthur Koestler, only a few decades ago, a famous writer, championed some of Lamarck's theories. He believed in evolution, and what he did was he provided an explanation for the change. That's what was needed. We see the change. What is the cause of the change? So now we come to Darwin. Darwin did not invent the idea of evolution. Darwin provided, and that's the issue, an explanation for how it happens. It's called the theory of natural selection. And that's what is now at issue. So let me give you a little information about Darwin. Darwin was born in 1809, the same year as Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, as you know, was born poor. Darwin was born into a rich family. His father was a well-known doctor, and his grandfather was a well-known scientist, a zoologist by the name of Erasmus Darwin, who also believed in higher and lower. Okay. His mother was the daughter of one of the richest men in England, You have some of his stuff in your house. Josiah Wedgwood. Got it? So his name was Charles Wedgwood Darwin. He didn't have to work any day of his life. Do you understand? Born into wealth. In fact, he married his cousin, Emma, who was also a Wedgwood. He was wedged into the Wedgwood. No, he was the, there he was in the Wedgwood. So he was a perfect person, kind of a leisure scholar. He didn't know what he wanted to do. He was very smart, and he liked to capture insects and study them. I used to know kids like that, by the way. No. I knew kids who also tortured them, but I mean, whatever it was, it captured them. He did not take school seriously, and his father didn't know what to do with him, so he sent him to Edinburgh, University of Edinburgh, to become a doctor. He said, oh, he doesn't want to be a doctor, a physician. So he said, all right, be a clergyman. He said, all right. He didn't want to be a clergyman. It was there that he became more and more interested in insects. He transferred to Cambridge, where he majored in the usual, and he got his B.A. Around the year 1831. And it was in that year that he didn't know what to do with his life. He took a voyage on a famous boat called the Beagle, which was going to explore organic phenomena in the South Atlantic and the South Pacific. They would ultimately get to the Galapagos, and in fact, when he returned after 7 years, in 1838, he wrote a famous book about his voyage, the discovery of all these organisms, living things that weren't even available in other parts of the world. I mean, something had taken place there in the Galapagos that whatever it was, it may not have taken place else, whatever. And he became fairly famous for that. And then, since he didn't have to work, and he had stomach problems, he retired. There was enough Wedgwood money. He retired to Kent, to a little village called Down. You can go see his house if you want to. I went to see it since it's one of my heroes. So, and there with his wife Emma, and he had lots of children, he began to study and study and study, do research, and already his wife is saying, when are you going to publish? He didn't really publish until 1859, some 21 years later. And what came out was this book called The Origin of Species. And in The Origin of Species, what is revolutionary is not the idea of evolution. What is revolutionary is the explanation for evolution. Some people reading the book, not familiar with the discussion that had been going on for a long time, thought it was absolutely what? It was the evolution part. But those who understood knew it was the natural selection. So what is natural selection? Natural selection is that the reason why certain organisms die and the reason why certain organisms survive is that in order for organisms to survive, they must be adapted, well adapted to their environment. So they may be adapted to environment A. And then there's global warming. Oh, I don't want to get you nervous here. Do you understand? And in fact, the temperature, what? Radically changes, and now they're not adapted to that temperature, and they perish. Or they were adapted to an environment filled with water, and then the environment turns to desert. So, the organisms that survive are the ones that are adapted to their environment. And through time, organisms change. Although Darwin wasn't able to explain the change, he had a principle for the flow of evolution. He said certain organisms change, and if they change, the ones that change to fit their environment will what? Survive. So now let me give you natural selection. Natural selection is huge garbage can of failures. Got it? That's what it is. That's what these the fossils, a huge garbage can of failures. Only a small number of the organisms that change actually survive. And by survive is meant they're able to reproduce, right? And that their offspring also survive. It's a mess. And in fact, anybody looking at the process could not imagine that there's some kind of a manager. It's a mess. Do you understand? Now, I know a lot of messy managers. So you have a choice. You can say, there is a manager and he's incompetent. But you got it? How can you say that? No. So it's just a mess. So that's the principle of natural selection, and that's what got everybody so mad. So once the book was published, Darwinism wasn't finished because Darwin did not provide an explanation of why organisms internally change. He could explain why a given organism survived or perished in a given environment, right? While he was still alive, there was a Czech monk by the name of Mendel. And he is the father, although he didn't know it at the time. He died actually in obscurity. He is the founder of what we call genetics. And it was Mendel who discovered the reality of the programming in every organism, which is contained in our genes. And then over time in the 20th century, and this is neo-Darwinism because you need Darwin plus genetics. Darwin alone is not enough. Darwin plus genetics. Genetics explain the process of change. Genes mutate. They mutate for a variety of reasons. It could be radiation. Or the genes may mutate because they have to keep duplicating themselves, and it's like typing. Sometimes you what? Press the wrong key, and in the process of duplicating themselves, they arrange themselves differently. Most of the mutations that occur are disastrous. But a few, just a few, enable the mutated organism to adapt more effectively to his environment. So, if I'm living in a hot environment and there's a mutation, and the mutation is that my left hand shrinks, finished. But then the environment turns what? Cold. And then there 1 out of 1,000,000 of the members of this species develops a fur coat. Oh. Got it? Then you have a change that will what? Or the beginning of it. Then you have a change that adapts you to the environment, and this little single one. The rest fall into the garbage can. It's a messy, chaotic system. And the people who read about it didn't like it. Now, the people who were most concerned, let me explain what there wasn't in Darwin. There was no God. Darwin said he was agnostic. There's no evidence, there's no evidence of, if you mean by a God a competent manager, then there's no God. If you mean by a God any manager, then maybe there is one, but he's what? Incompetent. Right. So nobody wants to accept that as an alternative. So no God. No purpose. It isn't like, remember the tree of life, we're heading from lower to upper. Things just what? change depending on the changes in the environment. There is no goal or end to which they are going. No ethics, they said. Because after all, our ethics depends on the purpose in the universe. There is a moral purpose that infuses every single atom of the universe. Oh. And if that doesn't exist, there's no foundation for ethics. Is ethics simply what we make up? There's no progress, which had become a big idea. Progress is we're moving from what? Lower to higher, lower to higher, lower to higher. I mean, Darwin says, I'm a scientist. Don't give me lower, higher. I can do complex and more complex. But it's not the case that because something is more complex that it is what? Higher? All right. The thing that outraged people was, he said, animals and us are made of the same stuff and come from the same place. When you go to the zoo, you are looking at your relatives. Well, I knew that before I read Darwin. I mean, I was aware. No, wait, that's it. What? And it's in total contradiction of the Bible. The Bible says that all living things and human beings were made in the same week. Now, there are two stories, of course. Genesis 1, they're all made in the same week. Genesis 2, it's a contradiction to Genesis 1, because in Genesis 2, first he makes man, that's Adam, and then Adam is bored. So then he makes him veggies. He's still bored. So then he makes them little animals, little dog that runs around, the whole thing, and he's still bored. Then he puts them to sleep, takes his rib, turns it into a woman, and he wakes up and he says, wow! And that's the story of creation. Now, the two stories are not, do you understand, compatible. They're not compatible, but that doesn't make any difference. Certainly it violates story number 1. So the consequence of it was, in England there broke out, and in America and all over Europe there broke out this battle. The forces of traditional religion now scream. This man is calling us monkeys. So the argument went on, but I do want to say that despite the opposition of traditional religion, which was fairly powerful, Darwin and his ideas were very successful. He ultimately, believe it or not, was buried in Westminster Abbey only 23 years after he published his book. Not bad, right? For an agnostic. To be buried right there, because Westminster Abbey is now the pantheon for all the great figures of England. Why did he make it? Well, by the end of the 19th century, the secularization of society was overwhelming. And the alliance between what we call money and science was absolutely overwhelming. And in fact, you weren't going to reverse that. There were several major constituencies that were in support of Darwin. One were the educated. Educated people generally, they were supportive of Darwin. A second constituency were the people in industry, the people who sort of ran the economy. They wanted science to be unfettered because they benefited from it, and in fact, so the third constituency was a new development. It's called liberal religion. Now, liberal religion, the world of religion divided at the end of the 19th century, into what we would call the people who hung on to the old tradition. Today we use the word fundamentalist. And then the others. The liberal religion went like this. Yes, they talk about heaven and hell, but we're living in suburban Boston, I mean, and there's Harvard. I mean, we can't really believe in that, so you stop talking about it. Liberal religion says, oh, a personal God who watches everything we do, even in the bathroom, and who rewards and punishes. Oh, no, we can't believe it. So, as you go along, the message totally changes. By the time you finish with it, Christianity is no longer the path to salvation. Christianity is now love. Well, who can be opposed to love, right? Who can be opposed to love, right? Is that the message? Is that the original message of institutional Christianity through the century? No! Is it now the message of what we call liberal religion? The answer is yes. So the next issue was easy. Darwin comes along. They're now lecturing to the captains of industry, to the educated, whatever it was. They're not going to take the fundamentalist message. So that you've got Christianity all misconstrued. You think that we are opposed to evolution. No, we're not. Because you have to understand, this whole evolutionary process is controlled by a loving and good God. Oh. So are you saying that natural selection is the sign and evidence of God? I mean, well, you have to understand, there's a kind of, and here's the phrase, there's a kind of intelligent design that now what? Moves through it all, moving organisms from the lower to the higher, and human beings are the supreme creation of God. He didn't do it in 1 week. What? It took him a long time, but that was his goal. There's a goal. All of evolution is heading for us. Now, we call these people not fundamentalists. I call them accommodationists. Accommodationists are people who are confronted with this overwhelming new world of secular knowledge. They have a choice. They can either reject it and fight it, or they can accept it. And so liberal religion accepted it and accommodated themselves to it. And the way they did that in the case of Darwin was to basically say, well, Darwin said there was no God, but what? We're looking at the same thing and we say there what? Is. And then we get the usual thing. Look at the human eye. Tell me there was no designer. Maybe it took a long time to get there, but tell me there was no designer. Look at the ear. Look at the human being and all his glory, whatever else it is, all the parts that work together. I mean, tell me there's no, got it? The whole thing. The design isn't like it was told in the Bible story, here's the design, make it. The design evolved through time. Oh. So, however, liberal religion also endorsed separation of religion and government. So they did not insist that that theory be included in the curriculum. So when I got biology in high school, it wasn't in the curriculum. I got natural selection. My teacher didn't say there was no intelligent design. That was something you discussed in church or synagogue or whatever. It was part of liberal religion. That's how it emerged. It was a way of reconciling Darwin and religion. Successfully, Darwin would have said no, but he died in 1882. So this became a way of doing it. And so now, if you went to a normal Episcopalian church, St. John the Divine, normal, that's very normal. I'll get something smaller, okay, in New York. And you have a very well-educated priest or minister, and he graduated from Harvard, Yale, whatever. He's not going to get up in St. John the Divine and tell a well-educated Episcopalian audience that evolution is false. He'll go like this. Now, you may think that there's an opposition between religion and science. Wrong. There's no opposition, do you understand? Because we believe in evolution, but we believe that it is infused with, got it, the spirit of the divine. Not a bad accommodation, by the way. And it worked. Because most establishment Protestant places accepted. By the beginning of the 20th century, they accepted. If you were a Northern Baptist, a Northern Methodist, a Northern Presbyterian, or a Northern Episcopalian, that's where you were. Otherwise, you would have left the church. So it was an interesting kind of accommodate, which helped Darwin, right? Because now all these people, now religion is divided. One part of religion, the fundamentalists, are saying, oh, wrong, 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 wrong. And the other one are saying, the ones who give all the money to the universities and industry, they're, no, yes, it's all right. It's okay. And one of the reasons for the success was that the fundamentalists, economically, were overwhelmingly poor. They had no media. They had no leaders whose voices would be heard anywhere, in any place. They didn't invite Billy Graham to the White House in those days. If there was a Billy Graham, he most likely was barefoot, somewhere in central Alabama without resources. If they invited anybody to the White House, it was the bishop, the Episcopal bishop of New York. Those are the people that made it to the White House. So the fundamentalists were weak. They could scream in their churches, did they deny? Yes, so who cared? They were weak. And then it happened. The thing nobody thought would happen. When I was a child, I always said, Michigan, Michigan, oh, it's wonderful. We are the arsenal of democracy. Oh, we have the industry of the world. And then there are those people in Mississippi. Ooh, poor, barefoot, ignorant, fundamentalist. They're going nowhere. We're on top of the world. Do you understand that? And it was true. But my forecast for the future was absolutely false. Because something was going to happen after the end of the Second World War that was going to change this whole picture. Got this group? Here's a group of people. They're called fundamentalists. They're basically poor. They're stuck in the South mainly. And they hate Darwin. In fact, in the 1920s in Tennessee, they managed to get a law passed outlawing evolution. But not in Michigan, or even Kansas, or California, or New York, or anybody where educated people were. You know, for me, when I first heard those stories, I said, Tennessee, of course. It's Tennessee. Bunch of hicks. Well, then came the trigger. After World War II, the textile factories in New England decided labor was too expensive. So they moved south to North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, whatever it was, together with other factories, and all of a sudden these poor people got jobs. And then they got shoes. And then they got houses. And then they got benefits. And then they got cars. Then they got 2 cars with a 2-car garage. And then they sent their children to school. They often sent them to fundamentalist schools, which now had money to organize themselves. Fundamentalist schools that ultimately turned into colleges that granted PhDs in biology, which maintained that the world was 6,000 years old. They had money, and they were on a roll. And now they voted their convictions. Simultaneously, as they were getting prosperous, they discovered that the party which they had voted for historically no longer fit. It was the Democratic Party. For Southern fundamentalists, they all voted Democratic. They were the support of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But now, with the civil rights movement in the 1950s and the 1960s, they changed their mind. They didn't wish to support the Democrats, so they shifted over to a party they had hated, the party of Abraham Lincoln, and they had hated Abraham Lincoln. They shifted over to the Republican Party, and now the South gradually turns into a Republican stronghold. And the Republican Party changes. The base of the Republican Party now becomes the American South, and at the base is this now new prosperous group of people who are fundamentalist. In fact, their numbers are sufficient. If you put them together with the Republicans from the North, they have a majority. The reason why Democrats could win elections was they had the South. They lost the South. And they lost the fundamentalists. Maybe that's a good thing. But they didn't have their votes. And now, out of this group comes a demand that had never been made by the Republican Party before. The heart of the Republican Party had been New England, upstate New York, and Pennsylvania. And in fact, the Republican Party was the party always in favor of education. It was the party in favor of Planned Parenthood. Remember those Republicans that came out of New England? The last thing they wanted their minister to do is to denounce Charles Darwin. But now it was very clear that if the Republicans were going to win elections, they better listen to this new constituency that had joined the party. They were not what we call economic conservatives, who used to be called, in the 19th century, economic liberals. They were social conservatives, true conservatives. God and country. And now they wanted their agenda to be heard. So what was on their agenda? Well, their agenda had been deeply affected by all the changes in America. The civil rights movement, which they detested, and the 60s, which they detested. Women asserting themselves, gays asserting themselves, children asserting themselves. The whole thing. It's enough. What's happening to the American family? What's happening to the American community? Where is morality? Oh. So now they got a message. The morality of America, historic morality, rests on Christian principles, on the kind of people we are. And if you support our agenda, we will guarantee a moral America. Oh, well. So what's on their agenda? Trim feminism, fight abortion, get rid of gays, right? Fight homosexuality, get rid of pornography, which is half the movies. No. That's called censorship, right? The whole thing. And now, tell the story of human beings right, so that they will not grow up thinking that we are only animals. So now comes the assault on the scientific establishment. You understand? That's a pretty big assault. The scientific establishment. And now on their agenda is changing the curriculum in the public schools, in biology classes. So now one of the flags of the movement is evolution. Affirm evolution and you deny God. You what? Deny God or you deny morality. You want your kids to be that way? You want to do that? And in fact, they're reinforced. They now have money. And they now have regular meetings. It's easy to mobilize Christian fundamentalists. They show up at church every Sunday. They're all filling up the chairs. Got it? You can give them a message directly. You can mobilize them. And I've said this before. To mobilize liberals, you have to go to the symphony. In the DSO lobby, it's hard. It's hard to mobilize them. Okay, fine. So, and they also were savvy with the media. They realized that television and radio were absolutely important, and while the more liberal factions were smug, they bought up all these stations, and now they were what? Sending out the message. How did this happen? How could it have? I remember my friend saying, how could it have happened? Such idiocy. Yeah. They're not idiots, they're smart. They know how to mobilize people. And now, there it is. So now they go, they get somebody in the White House. They helped him get in the White House. His name is Ronald Reagan. Now, Ronald Reagan and Nancy are not the stuff out of which Christian fundamentalists were made. They're Hollywood. And they like a good party, and he had a wonderful sense of humor, and he was quite charming, the whole thing. But he said, certainly in the election in 1980, to Jerry Falwell, the leader of the fundamentalists, he said, I'm on your side, Jerry. You can count on me. And then he comes into power. He doesn't give them anything. And every time they show up in the White House, there's Ronald. He's very charming. And he says, you know, I love your cause, the whole thing. Nothing. He even invites Billy Graham to the White House. That started with Nixon. The last bishop of the Episcopal Church invited to the White House, I don't know when. They're over, finished. If you want the leader of your movement invited to the White House, stop being an Episcopalian. They won't go. Now the fundamentalists are there. They've got political power. They're the people who are invited. And Ronald Reagan, look, I just had Billy Graham. We have prayer breakfast, sir. Don't give me a break. You know, Congress isn't always cooperative in the whole thing. He didn't push that agenda because Ronald Reagan's main agenda was economic. And then Ronald Reagan was followed by a New England Republican who became a Texan, who had a kind of divided personality. His wife, Barbara, was opposed to the anti-abortionists. She was in favor of abortion, the whole thing. So he still was part of this New England Republican. And however, he believed that you have to listen to these people. So he allowed them in 1992 to take over his convention in Houston, and that proved to be a disaster. He was defeated by Bill Clinton, using that against him. But his son then ran for the presidential office. And this is very interesting. He comes out of what I would call, they're just New England Republicans. New England Republicans are not religiously fanatic. It's considered in bad taste. Do you understand me? It's considered in bad taste. But he, raised in Texas, he's a Texan. And basic to the culture of Texas is fundamentalist religion. Texas at one time was poor, 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 and then they found this black, thick stuff called oil. And now those fundamentalists are rolling in money. And he claimed that his life was rescued by being born again. So for him, yes, he talks about God all the time. Now you have to understand, with all this frustration and encouragement, this group of people tried to get legislation in the different states of the Union that would provide an alternative to evolution. What they really wanted was to ban evolution in the schools. That's impossible. The only thing they could do is somehow insinuate it using a liberal principle. The liberal principle is, do you believe in freedom of discussion? Yeah. Well, if you believe in freedom of discussion, why do we have only one idea? What would be intelligent would be that a student comes into the biology class and the teacher now presents him with what? Alternatives. So one alternative, which is only an alternative, only a theory, is Darwinian evolution. Forget that it's now the foundation of biological medicine, pharmacology, whatever. Forget it. It's just a theory. And now there's another theory. Comes out of Genesis 1. And it says the world was created 6,000 years ago, and all life was created at the same time. And so why can't you just be a nice teacher, huh? Don't you believe in freedom? Well, yeah, I know. So that's what they're pushing for. And they got the Board of Education, the State Board of Education, Kansas actually, to turn to a law. Now the courts, over the years, have basically legislated against it. Not legislated, decided against it. But they don't stop trying, because their feeling is the courts will ultimately change, and then we'll get a friendly court, and then things will be okay. But the first strategy ended in frustration because the fundamentalists are a minority, although polls indicate that over 1/2 of the American people do not believe in evolution. Polls indicate. That's our educational system. Over 1/2 do not believe in evolution. And in fact, all of that's reinforced by fundamentalist preaching. But despite that, there's a large body of people in this country who aren't comfortable with 6,000 years old, made all at once. Come, give me a, no. So that was strategy 1. And a year ago it's been going on for a while, by the way. I mean, this other strategy has been going on for a while. The fundamentalists picked up an idea that had started in liberal religion. It's called intelligent design. Do you remember that? I talked to her. So instead of denying change, see, the story out of the Bible is so extreme. No change, everything at the beginning, forget the fossils, the whole thing. I mean, too extreme. So strategy 2, see, when strategy 1 doesn't work, you have to be flexible, right? Strategy 2 is to appeal to all those people sort of in the middle. After all, the overwhelming majority of the people in this country believe in God. So now, you don't call it God because the courts would throw that out as the introduction of religion into the public schools. So now you use this phrase, intelligent design. What you say is, yes, there may have been all this change. I personally don't think that happened, but it may be that there was all this change. And there may have been all this evolution, things moving from lower to higher, but behind it all is the planning of God, the perfect planner. And if you look at the organisms and what they are, you know it would be impossible, given how we are adapted to our environments and whatever else, our eye, our ear, the whole thing. It would be impossible to have it happen simply by chance. So if we can't get creationism into the schools, we'll get intelligent design. That's step one. Got it? That's step one. Intelligence. So now the teacher says, there are two explanations for the change. One is natural selection, as articulated by Charles Darwin, and the other is intelligent design. So, there it is. It's on the map. And now I want to tell you, over the next few years, you are going to see school board after school board after school board after school board invaded by Christian fundamentalists insisting on the introduction of intelligent design. Intelligent design is nothing more than a what? A second tactic for creationism. It's opening the door, and they will use this argument over and over again that certainly liberals understand. What kind of people are you to shut out other ideas? Isn't education that people are exposed to what? To different ideas? Why in the science class can't they be exposed to different ideas? And quite frankly, and I've heard it, I find that many of the liberals don't know how to respond. I mean, because creationism, you can always look at it, that's ridiculous. Intelligent design? No. So, if you'll come back in 5 minutes, I will tell you how I would choose to respond to the people, do you understand, who propose intelligent design. Thank you. Let me turn to the problem of responding, or how one needs to respond, because this is not a trivial issue. This is an assault on science. And if the United States of America should lose its edge on biological science, do you understand what it would, I mean, one of the few things in this country that works is that edge. If anything intrudes on that, if anything was there that would drive out or drive away the people who are the engines of that, we're in deep trouble. In fact, most likely, most fundamentalists in this country will lose at least 10 to 15 years of their life. The consequence of driving these people out. So let's turn to this thing called intelligent design. It starts off by saying Just as a watch has a watchmaker, so the world has a world maker, and it's quite obvious that this world maker is there in addition, because just look at how wonderful all the organisms are. Look at the flowers, look at the insects, look at the people, I mean, whatever else it is. It's impossible to imagine that this all happened by chance. So, the design argument says, there is a purpose that infuses nature and which leads from lower forms of life to higher forms of life, the culmination of which is the human being. And this process is good. I mean, you could have a mean, cruel, and vicious designer. You could. I mean, I've known them. You could have, but no. What is being said here is that what has happened in the process is an expression of goodness. Whoever the designer, he is what, or she is good. And in fact, if you look at the process is good. And although we cannot see it because we are simply small parts of the universe, if it is good, that means that there exists in the universe, among all the parts, this wonderful harmony. Everything is harmonious. Everything fits together. Now, for Darwin, that wasn't true. He didn't see the harmony. But certainly intelligent design says there is. There has to be. If the process is good, then ultimately all things are subsumed under the good, and everything is harmonious. So all organisms in some way are tied up with all other organisms in some perfect harmony, since the designer itself, himself, herself is indeed perfect. All right. So now, let me turn to the argument. There are certain problems with the argument. All right. I know I'm perfect, but there are problems. I know our knees are perfect. Do you know our knees are perfect? I mean, only the best designer in the world would have created the knees that we have. Our backs, oh, that's it. You know, somewhere in evolutionary time, I don't know exactly when, 5 million years ago or 7 million years ago, we walked on all fours, or we hung from the trees, all right? And our back worked very, very well. And then this designer decided to have us stand up straight. And he adjusted our pelvis a little bit in the whole, you know, so we could do some walking and whatever else it is. But he left us basically with the same back. And that's why all my friends in this perfectly designed, and that's why all my friends in this perfectly designed world have all these back problems. I have lots of contemporaries with heart disease. Now, I noticed the designer gave us 2 lungs. So we have a reserve. If one lung goes bad, you have a what? Got another. We got 2 kidneys. If one goes bad, you got another. We got 2 ears. If one goes bad, you got another. We got 2 eyes. If one goes bad, you got another. Would it have hurt to have 2 pumps? I mean, wouldn't that be the basic? Give me an extra pump. So if the pump goes, what kind of a designer? What we are is the product of a series of happenstance circumstances, do you understand? All pasted together. Some parts are absolutely wonderful, and some parts are not so wonderful. And so to talk about that perfection, in fact, I have a few, articles have appeared everywhere in the press. There's so many on what we call this thing. Brilliant as the design of the eye is, it betrays its origin with a telltale flaw. The retina is inside out. The nerve fibers that carry the signals from the eye's rods and cones, which sense light and color, lie on top of them and have no plunge through a large hole in the retina to get to the brain, creating the blind spot. No intelligent designer would put such a clumsy arrangement in a camcorder, and this is just one of hundreds of accidents frozen in evolutionary history that confirm the mindlessness of the historical process. You can go on and on. I mean, they're books. So what perfection? All right. Second problem, the environment. We are perfectly, not so perfectly, designed for existing in a very small environment in the universe. It's called air, right? It's a little pocket around the surface of the planet. Once I leave this pocket, I am finished, which means I can't even survive in most of the universe without technologies that are overwhelming in their complexity. So if God loves me or whatever, if he's designing environments for organisms, why wouldn't he design me for a vacuum? No. I mean, it's like somebody runs you over with a car, and then, having run over you, gets out of the car and says, "Can I help you?" Why did you give me this problem to begin with? I didn't ask for the problem. You said, "Here's the air pocket." Why do I need an air pocket? You're the designer. I am a prisoner of this. Do you understand? And so, well, you're perfectly designed for an air pocket. You would think with imagination they could have thought of what? An alternative. All right. The cruelty. So, I know there was, Joseph Campbell said it, but when animals are being eaten, they sort of enjoy it. They know it's part of the continuity of life, the eater and the eaten and the whole thing. Do you know what nature is? I watch it sometimes. It's one thing eating another. I mean, there's reproduction, and there are in birds and higher mammals what we call nurturing. Do you understand? But on the whole, it's one thing eating another. And so I say, if I were designing a scenario, right? If I were designing the perfect world, I would design a scenario in which organisms, I'm designing it. I have the power to design anything I want. I would design a world in which organisms are not destroying other organisms in order to survive. Yeah. We live in a very cruel world. In order for organisms to survive, they have to eat each other. We are in constant and overwhelming competition. When people talk about harmony, and I wrote about it in Staying Sane in a Crazy World. It's fishing, you know. Fishermen say to me, "Oh, it's so restful, so peaceful, and so wonderful." Well, you be the fish. God! I mean, it's like mind-boggling. All right. And there is no harmony. And that's what Darwin said. We live in this world, however it evolved, which sometimes is overwhelmingly disharmonious. Every organism has a different agenda, and we are competing. We're competing for space, we're competing for food, the whole thing. Not an environment of harmony, it's an environment of disharmony. I have these people that go on talking about Gaia, the goddess of earth, everything sort of fits in together, gobble, 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 but it's all sort of, one gets gobbled, you gobble, the whole thing. I don't wish to be gobbled. I mean, even the design of life. Once you're old enough to know what you really need and want, your body falls apart. No, it should be reversed. It should be in reverse. The whole, I mean, once you start on this, do you understand? What are they talking about? So this assault has great dangers. First of all, one of the great dangers is science is not a democratic discipline. If it were democratic discipline, you would go into class and you would say to the class, is the earth flat or round? We'll take a vote. Science is an elitist discipline. Most scientists don't like to face it because they may be liberals. It's an elitist discipline. If 99% of the class hasn't done its homework and 1% has, that 1% what? Wins. You have the evidence, you win. Now, people regard that as like this kid in class when I told him what's my opinion? People say, well, it's my opinion. Yeah, I know, kid. It's your opinion. But it presently is an idiotic opinion. You haven't done any homework. You have no research. I think, I feel. Thank you. Don't become my doctor. So it's an elitist discipline, and we now live in a world which is overwhelmingly egalitarian in its attitudes. So what people are saying is, well, if it's my opinion, you ought to respect it. So now I'm going to say something that's outrageous, but I'm going to do it. I respect all people, but I do not respect all opinions. There is a difference. There are idiotic and dangerous opinions which I do not respect. Do you understand? I don't respect it. I mean, if you tell me all blacks are inferior, I don't respect it. Don't tell me, well, it's my right, I feel that it's true. I don't care. Do you have evidence to support the statement that you are making? That's it. Do your homework. It's part of the problem in our leisure culture. People do not wish to do their homework. They simply wish to assert their rights. My right to my opinion, whether I do my homework, don't do my homework. In science, you better do your homework. The second is the public is overwhelmingly indoctrinated by the teachers of biology, but by these thousands and thousands of preachers in mega churches, who knows what. Do you understand? Who talk to them? Because in order to understand the principle of natural selection, that requires a certain level of sophistication. I mean, the whole thing. So now the great danger is we live in a democratic society. Democratic societies can elect leaders and people who, catering to the public, may choose to punish and cripple science. The great danger in our society is that we will intimidate scientists. I have a friend out in Kansas, by the way, who stopped teaching biology. He wasn't going to be in the, do you understand? He was a great biology teacher. When this trouble started, he wasn't going to stay in the system because it was just, He can make more money elsewhere, do you understand? He wasn't going to subject himself to this. He was just going to leave. So here's a person these kids need who's driven out of the profession, and he'll be replaced by somebody willing to circulate the nonsense. One of the great dangers in a democratic society is that ultimately you elect leaders who cater to the public and appoint judges who no longer will defend science against the masses, but who will what? Who will simply agree, of course, why not? It's all the principle of freedom of expression. And the greatest danger of all, nobody talks about it. We have a declining economy in this country. Most places of declining economy have flight. People always came here because they always felt this was a friendly environment to both science and making a good living. And I do want to tell you that in time, if this assault on science continues, and by the way, this is just one issue, if this assault on science continues, then the people who are involved in the biological sciences will simply pick themselves up and they will go elsewhere. And we will be left with a nation of people controlled by anti-science. Now, there are many opportunities for us to offer resistance. I mean, the business community, quite frankly, is very disturbed. I mean, even if you are a pharmaceutical company or a medical establishment, the prevention of stem cell research, I mean, what are we talking about? Or the undermining of the integrity of biological education. All these leaders of industry, do you understand? They have a vested interest in defending the integrity of science, because if the scientists vanish, they'll have nothing. And that leads to the Republican Party. Right now in the Republican Party, the Christian fundamentalists prevail. And in fact, the historic agenda of the Republican Party, which was a free enterprise system without the welfare state and without, government interference, that's a secondary agenda. There are many Republicans who believe in Agenda 2 who don't believe in Agenda 1. They don't want their party taken over by the Christian fundamentalists. They don't want it. So I hope, by the way, this confrontation takes place in 2008. There is a man that wants to be the Republican candidate for president. His name is John McCain. And if the Republican Party continues to have enormous problems, as it presently has, one of its leading Christian fundamentalists, Tom DeLay, the king of morality, is under indictment, the whole thing. So there are problems. And they may, by 2008, somebody more credible. There are Republican leaders who will not surrender to the Christian fundamentalists. And something has to happen in that party to restore the party to the people who what? Controlled it before and who were able to appeal to a broader constituency than the constituency of the Christian fundamentalists. So we'll see what happens. All I want to say is, one of the battles we are now fighting in America is the battle for the integrity of science. Got it? The future of science in this country. And when we fight that battle, we have to remember four things. Evolution is not a theory. Once you fall into that trap, because otherwise, if it's a theory, then you could say the world is round as a theory. So why don't we have the teachers say there are two theories about the earth. One is that the earth is round, and there are people, by the way, who still believe this, and there is a theory that the earth is flat, and I want you as a class to think about it and talk about it. What? Stark raving mad. The second, this issue is not about freedom. It's about scientific truth. That is, we have the freedom to look for evidence. But the conclusion is not simply up to my intuition, nor is it the issue of democracy. In science, we don't vote for the truth. One of the purposes of education is to discipline you so that you understand how important it is to find the evidence, not simply to stand up and assert yourself. You got to do your homework. Because once we allow them to drop the words freedom and democracy, then we're through, because what you're a meanie, right? That's not the issue. And it's not about the persecution and exclusion of religion. Intelligent design is a perfectly appropriate idea since there's no evidence for it. Intelligent design is a perfectly appropriate idea in an institution of religion, right? And in fact, if preachers, ministers, rabbis, priests, whatever, want to articulate it within those institutions, that is great. You can freely go and listen to it, or you can freely leave, or whatever you want to do. That's where it belongs. But it doesn't belong in a science classroom, because science is a discipline. And either you enter that discipline, or you don't have science. Now, I do want to say, because I think that there are forces in this country who do not wish to see the integrity of science undermined. It would be absolutely devastating. They are on the Democratic side, and they're also on the Republican side. I have an optimism, not that this force will not go away. They're going to invade every local school board. You finally think that they'll go to Melvindale. They went to Melvindale. And they don't work in Melvindale, they'll go to Lincoln Park. They don't work in Lincoln Park, they'll pick up Southgate. They're not going to stop. My optimism is that in the end, we in this country are now confronting a major economic disaster. And the last thing we need in this country is to allow a group of people to undermine the integrity of our success. And that is the edge on science that we always have had. So I'm optimistic because I can't imagine that all the vested interests, and some of them are powerful, will allow this to happen. But I do want to say, it will also depend on the ordinary citizen, on people like us, do you understand? So that when we are confronted with the issue, we don't surrender to the crazy reasoning that they give us, because the second attempt is more subtle than the first attempt. We need to offer our resistance because we need to save science and we need to save America, and thank you all very, very much.